For medieval Christians, the pilgrimage to Jerusalem was an act of extraordinary devotion. These pilgrims of various nationalities, professions, and social classes were motivated by both religious piety and personal curiosity. Rich, spiritual rewards awaited those who could visit the city sanctified by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Yet the long, expensive, and dangerous journey from Europe to the Holy Land was itself also an act of penance. Therefore, many of those who did make the trip to the Holy Land tended to be from the higher classes, including landowners, members of the clergy, and prosperous merchants, simply because they had the money. European pilgrimage to the Holy Land had been going on since the 4th century AD, and in some cases even earlier. The Muslim conquest of Jerusalem in the 7th century and turmoil at home in Europe slowed the rate of pilgrimage until travel to the Holy Land became easier, starting early in the 11th century. Friendly nations began to control much of the land route to Jerusalem when Hungary became Christian, and also when the Christian Byzantines extended their empire into Asia Minor and the Balkans. While a party of pilgrims might have consisted of just a half-dozen people, many such small groups often left on pilgrimage together. Also, parties of pilgrims would encounter others along the route and travel together for greater safety. A caravan of pilgrims often included a great many people, perhaps dozens or more, and the numbers grew as the pilgrims proceeded. Starting in 1064, a pilgrimage of 7,000 plus people, led by a group of nobles and bishops, set out from Germany to Palestine. Several sources who took part in the journey later had their stories recorded in the annals of various German abbeys and monasteries between 1073 and 1077. In the year 1065, a great multitude flocked to Jerusalem to worship at Christ's sepulchre. Who would believe the crowd of nations who went there? Since much might befittingly be said about this expedition, I hope that nobody will find it tedious if I mention in passing one or two details. Among those who undertook the journey were its leaders: Siegfried, Archbishop of Mainz; William, Archbishop of Trier; Otto, Bishop of Regensburg; and Bishop Gunther of Bamberg. This last was at the time regarded as the glory and pillar of the entire German kingdom. Those who knew him intimately were wont to claim that he embodied many virtues to perfection. Such a huge multitude of counts and princes, rich and poor, came in the train of these leaders that the number probably exceeded 12,000. Once they had crossed the river Danube, the danger of robbery and capture beset them on all sides, but they avoided it by their skill and watchfulness, and at length reached the city of Constantinople. Bishop Gunther made such a good showing that the Byzantines gaped at him in wonder. They imagined that he was not a bishop, but the king of the Romans, disguised as a bishop, since only in disguise would he have been able to travel to the Lord's sepulchre through the Byzantine Empire. After some days' journey, the pilgrims reached Laodicea, traveling along various narrow and dangerous routes, which Bishop Gunther described when he wrote to his friends at home. "In truth, brethren, we passed through fire and water, and at length the Lord led us to the place which Holy Scripture calls Laodicea in Syria. We took on those faithless servants the Ugrians, and those devious bandits the Bulgars. We put to flight those shameless debauchers the Uzi, and encountered the proud and imperious Greeks of Constantinople. We suffered the Romanians, whose raging was beyond the fury of man or beast. We have endured difficulties indeed, but greater trials lie ahead." Having stayed for a few days in Laodicea, they set out to meet the large numbers who were returning daily from Jerusalem. These men reported the deaths of innumerable companions and disasters endured by themselves, and displayed wounds still gory. They declared loudly that nobody could possibly pass by that route, since the most savage race of Arabs occupied the whole territory, thirsting for human blood. So what were they to do? Where were they to turn? They swiftly decided to lay aside their fears and trust in the Lord, knowing that whether alive or dead, they were of the Lord, and with eager hearts, they set out for the holy city through pagan lands. While the German pilgrims and their bishops were traveling towards Jerusalem, they ill-advisedly revealed the extent of their wealth to the people among whom their journey lay. They would have laid themselves open to extreme danger, had not divine mercy restored what had been lost through human indiscretion. For the barbarians, who had poured out from their towns and fields to see such famous men, were driven by a great hope and desire for plunder. So when the pilgrims were just a short distance from Ramah, on Good Friday, around the 3rd hour of the day, they were attacked by marauding Arabs. These Arabs had learned of the approach of a company of famous men, and so attacked them in an armed throng to see what spoils they might plunder. Many of the Christians, thinking they might rely on their religion for assistance and salvation, had trusted in God's protection rather than in weapons when they had set out for foreign parts. They were, as a result of the first attack, brought down by many wounds and robbed. Among them was William, Archbishop of Trier, whose arm was almost paralyzed by wounds. He was left naked and half dead. The other Christians did their best by throwing stones, in plentiful supply owing to the nature of the territory, not so much to drive away danger, but as a desperate measure to escape imminent death. Gradually retreating, they descended to a farmhouse, which lay some distance from their path. From the sound of the name, they guessed that they must be near Capernaum. They went inside, and the bishops all occupied the main room on the upper floor because the enclosure wall was so old, low, and rickety that it might easily fall down. The house was in the middle of the enclosure, and its upper room was sufficiently high above the ground to act as a base for defense, almost as if it had been designed for that very purpose. Since the Arabs could not keep up their attack by superiority of position or in a pitched battle, they changed their policy from one of lightning attacks to one of siege, and used the weapons of starvation and exhaustion, where the sword had proved futile. They divided their only too plentiful forces into units of hundreds of men, so that, operating in relays, they might attack without respite. They suspected that since vital supplies were running out, it would not take them long to finish their task. The Christians, for the whole of Friday and Saturday nights, right up to the 3rd hour of Easter Day, were attacked without a break. Nor did their wicked enemy allow them a single second during which they might refresh themselves by snatching a little sleep. Because the specter of death was always before their eyes, they wanted neither food nor drink, but took whatever they could since they had almost no resources. On the 3rd day, exhausted by toil and hunger, they had reached the point of desperation, their courage and strength tested beyond endurance by unbroken fasting. One of the priests with them cried out that they had gone wrong by relying on their weapons rather than on the God of hope and strength, and by trying to avert by their own resources the disaster that had befallen them. For this reason, he went on, they should give themselves up to God, especially since 3 days' starvation had made them quite incapable of resistance. It would not be difficult for God to show them mercy and rake them from under the yoke of the enemy, for God had many times miraculously freed his people in the very last hour of their need. They might further conclude that the barbarians had launched so great an offensive to rob them, not to kill them. If they managed to take their goods, they would release them untouched. During the fighting, one of the Saracen leaders seized the piece of cloth which he wore around his head after the custom of his race, and made it into a lasso which he threw around Bishop Gunther's neck. The bishop was not prepared to put up with such a disgrace, and gave his assailant a hefty blow in the face, which sent him sprawling to the ground. As the man fell, the bishop shouted to him that he would pay him back for his impiety in having the audacity to raise his unclean, idolatrous hands against the priest of Christ. At once, clerics and laymen rushed at this man, and at others who had climbed into the upper room. They bound the Saracen's hands so tightly behind his back that blood burst through his skin and nails. News of this bold deed reached those who were in the lower part of the farmhouse, and the men there treated the Arab leaders in the same way. At this point, all the laymen clamored to their maker for his assistance and took up arms again. They seized the enclosure wall and with a concerted effort expelled and then routed the guards around the gate. Their actions were so vigorous, and met with such unexpected success on all fronts, that you would have never guessed they had endured 3 days of hunger and toil. Indeed, their vitality was such that the Arabs, exceedingly disturbed by this alarming turn of events, lost heart. Then they began to suspect that their own leaders had made supplies available to the Christians. This revived their hostility, and they rushed into battle. They made a wall of arms and prepared to burst through the men in the enclosure. And they would have succeeded, had not the Christians speedily adopted the stratagem of placing the Arab leaders, whom they had bound, where the enemy pressed most fiercely, and where the weapons fell most thickly. Above their heads stood a Christian wielding a drawn sword. He shouted to the Arabs by means of an interpreter that unless they halted their attack, the Christians would not use arms in retaliation, but the heads of their princes. At this, the Arab princes themselves, already uncomfortable from the tightness of their bonds, were alarmed by the swords hanging over their heads. They screamed out at their men to act with circumspection, lest in their stubbornness to continue the battle they might, when all hope of mercy had died, inspire their deaths. Thus the pilgrims crushed a great force massed against them in a pitched battle. In this way, they experienced no difficulty on the outward journey to Jerusalem. There they offered thanks to God for returning them alive after such an ordeal. Then they returned through Christian lands as planned. Finally, they reached Hungary, where, alas, Bishop Gunther of Bamberg was struck down by an early death, and thus brought a sad end to a successful and joyful return. He died on July 23, 1065, having enjoyed the rewards of this world. He was a man of high moral and spiritual standing, and well endowed with worldly goods. The First Crusade was launched 30 years later, with ensuring the safety of Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land as one of its main stated goals.